Listen, I know my video quality isn't the best, and my audio quality isn't the best either. But I think that I may have some things to share with the world in regards to dubstep. So welcome, class. This is Dubstep 101. This series goes through the basics of dubstep, and as this course continues, concepts and applications of those will get more and more advanced. I'm going to be walking through sound design, composition, song structure, and the basics of the music theory of dubstep. So if you think that'll interest you, and you want a more in-depth approach to the basics of one of the most difficult genres of music there is to produce, then you've come to the right place. I'm not an expert, but I like to think that I can share things with you that are helpful on the journey towards making interesting music. Now, I am not the most well-versed in the history of dubstep, but from what I understand, it comes from a sort of fusion between UK garage music and like this edited subgenre of reggae, where basically they would take just the instrumentals and boost the bass and do some interesting things with the drums. And sort of dubstep grew out of that, and then it sort of was brought to America by Skrillex and made into this bigger, more extravagant, dancey kind of genre. And that's the kind of dubstep we're going to make. We're not going to be making classic dubstep. We're going to be making bro step and rhythm and melodic dubstep and drum step and that kind of thing. We're going to be making the newer stuff. We're not going to be doing classic mode. Because if you're looking to make dubstep, that's probably what you're going to want to do anyways. And the classic stuff is, it's good on its own right, but it's not what we're covering in this thing. I use FL Studio, but I know how to use other DAWs. I've used Ableton Live and Logic Pro before, and I have a basic understanding of Pro Tools. If you want to, so even if you use another DAW than FL Studio, or if you don't have a DAW at all, you'll be able to understand the concepts from this, because I will be explaining it in a way that can be applied to any sort of music software. Like a lot of EDM genres, dubstep is primarily defined by the type of drum beat and the tempo. And dubstep sits anywhere between 140 and 150 beats per minute, with most modern dubstep songs being around 150 beats per minute. It's not like it's a rule that you have to follow, but it's basically what is expected. What makes FL Studio different than other DAWs is that it is all built around this sequencing, this drum sequencer, rather than being built around tracks and instruments. I personally like this workflow. A lot of people have problems with it, and it is not the most ideal way of learning music production, because if you were to switch to another DAW, it would be a completely different universe. Because in another DAW, you would drag in a kick drum, and you would make an audio track where only the kick drum is on the audio track, and all the effects applied to it are only applied to this track. Now, in FL Studio, there is no real link between tracks and the mixer and the instrument that is put to them. The tracks are just a visual thing. The instruments are, you bring your instruments into the sequencer, you create patterns, and then you put them on the playlist, and then the playlist with the playhead triggers the patterns. It doesn't do anything beyond that. That's how it works in FL Studio. So you can bring in audio, MIDI, or automation clips, and then it is triggered when the playhead reaches them, and because of this, the patterns are also, these are not independent files. These are all one file that is being triggered whenever the playhead reaches them. So if you do something to this audio file, for example, fade it out, it affects every single one. So if you want to create a copy rather than just have it play the same file again, you want to hit make unique or make unique as sample, which will save it as a unique WAV file in your computer. Hitting make unique will just make it so it's only unique within the project, and it won't be a unique WAV file. Make unique as sample will save everything you have done to it into the file itself, all of the processing within the sampler menu. So right now we have a kick drum that is here, linked to mixer insert number 2, which I guess is fine. I'm just gonna move it over to be number 1, and I'm going to drag in a snare drum. A great way of getting drums for dubstep is to just find sample packs, but you can also go on to Splice and just type in dubstep drums and you'll find them. What makes dubstep drums unique is that they are heavily transient. Meaning the beginning of it is very high-pitched and snappy. So you have a very strong attack on dubstep drums, a lot stronger than most other genres. I'm going to use this one. Dubstep has a simple drum beat. That is just, if you, in a 4/4 measure, you got the kick on 1, the snare on 3, and every either 4 or 8 bars you get some sort of fill. And a lot of the time that's either just a repeat of the kick on any subdivision of the beat, or you bring in some toms. But that is not really that necessary. So this is your 4-bar basic drum beat. Dubstep also uses complex cymbal patterns. Not that they're rhythmically complex, but it usually uses 2 to 5 unique cymbal sounds. Usually an open and a closed hi-hat. A ride cymbal, and a crash cymbal. In FL Studio, if you just hold Alt, you can move the track and all of the effects that are on it over to a different place in your mixer. That's a good way to organize things. The reason I am linking the tracks to the mixer is to make it easier to understand for people who use DAWs other than FL Studio. I'm just going to bring the volume down on this crash cymbal a little bit. Now I'm going to create a pattern that is going to include multiple different instruments, which is something you can't do in other DAWs without using a rack. But in FL Studio, your patterns are not, the tracks are not linked to patterns, are not linked to instruments. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these hi-hats, I'm going to link them to insert 3. I'm going to take the ride cymbal and link it to insert 4. I'm going to rename them because because I'm using multiple instruments within the same pattern. I'm going to disable using loop points because if you don't do that in FL Studio, sometimes it'll just repeat the sample. It'll loop it over and over again. So you want to create a pattern like this. You can experiment with having the open on top, the open first and then the closed one, or the other way around. And usually the ride cymbal is either on each quarter note, it's on the offbeats, or it lines up with the kick and the snare. Any of those is perfectly acceptable. I put it on the offbeats to give it more motion. And when you have a kick and a snare, which are punchy and go completely through the rest of your mix, it's really not always the most useful thing to have your cymbals in the same space, because dubstep drums are actually have a lot of presence in the high end. And a lot of the time they can cancel out the heaviness of the drums. In most genres of music, it is pretty common music production process to do something called sidechain compression, which is where you will use the kick drum, which is very low in the frequency spectrum, as a trigger for a compressor which reduces the volume whenever there is sub bass or any bass sound, to make it so that you can hear the kick drum without it getting too muddy. And a lot of the time that's how you get the pumping sound in like house music. But in dubstep, because the entire frequency spectrum is basically being filled most of the time, especially during the drops, basically every sound, or at least most sounds, get sidechain compression, as are sidechained with the kick and the snare as their trigger. So the way I do this is I set up a send bus, or an auxiliary. I set up an auxiliary channel, which is also commonly referred to as a send, which if you hold control, you can select multiple channels, and you can right click, and there's this little thing here, you can dock it to either side of your mixer. I like doing it on the right side because that's how it looked in older versions of FL, and that's how it looks in Ableton. And then I make one of them as a sidechain compressor. And then I link. Then instead of sending the signal out through the master bus, I send it to this auxiliary channel. Anything that I want to have that compression happen to, I will send to this auxiliary channel, which is going to take information from the kick and from the snare through a sidechain, which is a audio link. See, FL Studio has visual cables. It's basically a link that doesn't have any sound coming through. It records the sound. Basically, the computer knows when the sound is coming through that cable, but you don't hear it. That's what a sidechain is. And in FL Studio, there is a sidechain input in the limiter compressor. So you can open up the Fruity limiter and go to the compression tab. A limiter is a type of compressor that stops any signal from coming through. And a compressor is simply just an automatic volume knob that will turn the volume down whenever something passes a certain threshold. So you bring this down. We'll just play these cymbals so I can demonstrate this. So now everything that is under this blue line will be compressed. And the ratio, this knob here, determines by how much. A lot of compressors have a thing called makeup gain, and the way compressors are a lot of the time used is to make the difference between the loudest and the smallest sound, the loudest and the quietest part of a signal closer together, and then bring up the volume so it sounds louder overall. But what we're going to be doing here is simply linking the sidechain. So instead of taking the audio that is going through the bus, it is going to be using the audio that is coming from the sidechains, which is the kick and the snare. So it ducks the audio. It reduces the volume whenever the kick hits. This kick is very long, so you can go in here and reduce the tail of the kick. And as you can see, it affects the graph. Ableton's compressor has an exact same thing. There's a little arrow when you can activate sidechain compression. You can just select any input from a drop-down menu instead of linking it through a cable, but it has the same effect, does the same thing. You can do the same thing in Ableton. I'm sure you can do the same thing in Logic. Actually, you can. It works very similarly in Logic. There's a menu within the plugin where you can select an input. The difference with FL Studio is you have to link it with a cable first, and then you select from here. Or you can right-click and just select any channel as well. Something that I frequently do is I will send both the kick and the snare to an auxiliary channel and then have them both be the input for the sidechain. But in this case, I'm just going to do a second limiter compressor here. Do the same thing, reduce the tail a little bit. And bring the release time back a bit. And that's how you start with the sidechain. Usually I have this sort of thing set up right from the beginning. The drum pattern with the sidechain on the hi-hats and the cymbals and all of that. Usually the first thing you do in a dubstep song is make the drum pattern. It's not a requirement. You can make whatever you want, whatever order, but that's how I do things. A simple way of creating some space is to simply have the hats panned one direction and the rides panned the other direction. And it is always a good idea to have the kick and the snare have their stereo separation reduced, because basically you always want to be hearing those at the center of your mix, because they're the most important part. When you take drums that are specifically designed for dubstep, they don't usually require a lot of processing. This snare is just a little bit loud. generally you want your kick and your snare to peak at around 0 dB, and then everything else to be slightly quieter than the kick and the snare. If you are sending your track off to a mixing and mastering engineer, you might want to have the entire thing be at around -6. But if you're doing it on your own, you're just going to want to mix and master within the same project. So basically mix and master as you're going. Well, mix as you go, then master at the end. And the most ideal way of doing that, in my opinion, is just to have everything peak at 0 dB. So you don't have to do very much with the mastering chain. So that's the drum pattern. Usually the place to start with the dubstep song is with the basses. And with the dubstep basses, the wubs and the growls and all of that stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up a synthesizer, and I'm going to explain how the sound design works. You don't have to have Serum for this. I'm going to be explaining the basic types of sound design for now, and then I'll get into more detail as the series continues. So the most basic dubstep sound starts with a triangle wave, which you can get in basically any synthesizer. The synth you want to be using is any synth that has FM capability. So Serum has it, Faceplant, Vital, Ableton's Operator has it, Citrus has it, FM8, obviously. There are a number of plugins that have FM-enabled features, but basically, this is I'm using Serum because it has a visual representation of what you're doing to the waveform. So you start with a triangle wave. You want to bring it down to a bass note. Instead of actually bringing it down, I have it coming down inside the plugin. Right now, this is on F2, but I have it showing up as F4 because of where it is in the plugin. I have it reducing 2 octaves in the plugin, so anything I play will come out 2 octaves lower from this oscillator. This oscillator is 2 octaves lower than it is saying in MIDI. I'm going to just make a half note. Set FL Studio to pattern mode. So we've just got an F here. And I'm going to activate a second oscillator. And Citrus, Operator, FM8 all have this ability. And I'm going to bring in another triangle wave. I'm going to turn the volume all the way off. In Serum, I'm going to activate FM from B. So what you want to be doing is activating FM, which is frequency modulation, using the basically every dubstep sound is made this way by taking a basic waveform and then using another waveform to modulate something about this one. And FM is a type of that, where it modulates frequency or pitch using a second oscillator. So I'm leaving this triangle here on the default setting right now. And I'm just going to slowly bring up the FM amount. as you can see, it makes it interesting. So I will bring the octave down a little bit. So that's how the basic growl bass comes. Now I'm going to be linking it to an envelope. I'm just using the LFO menu in Serum because it's easier to use. But basically, you want to be linking these parameters to an envelope, and most synths that have FM capability do have envelopes that can do this. So I'm just going to turn the volume off, and I'm going to link LFO1, which I'm using as an envelope, to activate the volume. So now, whenever I press a note, it's going to play this shape in the volume. And I'm also going to link the amount of FM to the same thing. And there we go, we've got a wubby. We've got a wub. The very simple wub. That's how the most simple wub is created. So usually, this will go through a filter. Now you want to think of filters the same way you think of human speech in terms of making dubstep sounds. The oo sound is lower, and the ya, the e sound is higher. So if you want to make a ya kind of bass, or like a yoi, you want the filter to come from higher and go lower and then back up. So yoi is like, a yoi bass would be like this. And a wub bass would be the opposite way. So you set it so it goes the other direction. So depending on what vowel shape you want, you can shape your filters in that way. There's a whole bunch of options inside of Serum, but I'm just going to leave it with a basic wub for now. And then I'm going to program in some notes just to give an example of what we're doing here. See, that's not too interesting. I'm going to send it to the sidechain. Remember what I told you about compression? The same thing applies to dubstep sounds. Remember what I told you about compression is with dubstep sounds, you want to make them as loud as possible. Right now, if you look at the monitor, the sound is not very loud. So we're going to bring in a compressor. You can turn up the gain if you want to, but a compressor makes it does this in a different way by sort of squishing the loudest frequencies down and then bringing the whole thing up, so it sounds louder altogether. I'm going to load in OTT, which is a multi-band compressor. It's a stock plugin in Ableton, and it's also a free download for anyone who doesn't have Ableton. The difference between OTT and other compressors is that it has a dry wet knob here called depth, and also it compresses the different bands in different ways. You can see here the high and low bands are louder than the middle bands. So for a dubstep sound, that's actually exactly what you want. So all I'm going to do now is I turn down the depth for this sound. Just mess with it until you find what you like. And I'm going to increase the gain here. And now we have a very loud. The sound isn't very interesting because it's the most basic form of a sound here. But that's that. Now, dubstep sounds, ironically, dubstep basses don't include the sub bass within the sound and are very heavy in the low frequency spectrum. They take up huge amount of space in the frequency spectrum. Look at this. It's basically the entire range of human hearing is being taken up by this one sound. So if I want to add in a separate sub bass to make the bass frequencies less muddy, I'm going to bring in a high pass filter, and I'm going to make it steeper. And I'm just going to bring it up to around 100 hertz-ish. It actually already sounds better. I'm going to bring the high end up a little bit more. I'm maybe go into OTT, bring the high end up a little bit more. And there we go. We've got and I'm going to bring in a sub bass. Now within Serum, there is a sub oscillator specifically designed for this to bring in a sub bass underneath that goes directly out. But I'm not going to use that because then it'll be processed by OTT and this filter here. So I'm going to bring in a separate sub bass signal here. I'm just going to use a simple sine wave. Any synthesizer can do it, but I'm going to use 3 oscillator, which is a stock FL Studio plugin, to do this. I turn the second two oscillators off, just have this one set to a sine wave, bring it down 2 octaves, and then I'm just going to copy these notes to this one, and I'm going to bring it down to the sub bass region. And again, because I have it set to be 2 octaves down, I can put it on octave 3, but it'll actually play as being an octave 1, which is like the lowest range possible for humans to hear. And that's what you want your sub bass to be, is like almost not hearable. You want to basically feel it, but not hear it. And in dubstep, you need a very present sub bass. I'm just going to do... So I'm just have this here. I'm going to have it linked to Sidechain compressor here. But as you can see, look, I've created a channel, but I have it in, I've created a track here, but the sub bass is actually on this track here, which isn't possible in other DAWs. So to make it easier to understand, I'm going to right click and hit split by channel. So now I'm going to bring the sub bass to its own track. I'm going to rename this pattern here. And now we've got a sub bass on its own track. Now, this is not a very interesting sound, is it? It's not a very interesting song, but it is the basics of how to start making dubstep, and I'm actually explaining what it is that you're doing rather than giving you a list of presets to use. So I'm going to be continuing to go through this process, but that's the end of this first video. The next one will come soon, where I will discuss more different types of sounds, but I encourage experimentation with the specific structure of your drop, the pattern you make. I suggest taking this basic concept for a sound and applying different waveform shapes to it. A lot of dubstep sounds use wavetables, which a lot of people have made using this process. I'm not going to talk about wavetables just yet, so just wait up a bit, because I want people to actually understand how the sounds come to be. And a lot of the sounds, like this basic growly wub thing that I made, this basic guy here. That basic sound is a lot of the time resampled and made into wavetables, and then you can cycle through it and make even more complex sounds out of those. But that's it for this video. Stay tuned for the next one. I hope you enjoyed. This has been Dubstep 101. The next class will come out shortly. I don't know what the hell I'm saying. Have a good one. Bye.